Some wars are remembered for their battles. A few are remembered for what they taught us about ourselves. The Peloponnesian War is one of the second kind. It is a turning point of the classical age and a rare thing in all of history, a war fought not between kings, not between professional armies, but between voting bodies of citizens. For 27 years, two of the greatest cities the Greek world had ever produced tore at each other. And we can see it all with startling clarity for one reason above all. An Athenian named Thucydides lived through it and set it down. This series opens where the war itself begins, with the stakes and with our chief witness, his method, his thesis about the true cause, and the long line of readers who fought over what he meant. The fighting ran for 27 years, from 431 BC down to 404 BC. Though war had been formally declared a year before the first blow fell, it set the two great city-states of Sparta and Athens against each other. But it did not stay between them. In time, it drew in most of the Greek world. It engulfed the heartland around the Aegean and reached west to the Greek colonies of Sicily and southern Italy, above all the great city of Syracuse. It even drew the eye of the great king of Persia, ruler of the last great Near Eastern empire, a realm stretching from the Aegean to the Indus River. His provincial governors, called satraps, held Western Asia Minor, and in the war's later years they intervened for their king, Darius II. There are two overriding reasons this one war rewards close study. The first is that it stands at the hinge of Greek classical history. That classical period spans the 5th and 4th centuries BC. It runs from 480 BC, the end of the Persian Wars, down to 323 BC, the death of Alexander the Great. Set that whole span out, and the Peloponnesian War sits at its center, the centerpiece of Greek political, military, diplomatic, even economic life. It is both an enormously important war and an exceptionally well-documented one, and that lets us look closely at the communities inside it. These were states where citizens voted, casting ballots in assemblies of adult men. This was no war of kings and no war of professional armies. It said citizen against citizen. That is what makes this war so rare. Across the whole of human history, in any tradition, a citizen body has almost never held sovereign power within a state, even when the vote was narrow. Only a handful of examples exist. The first is the Greek city-states themselves, Athens, Sparta, and the rest. The second is the Roman Republic. The third is the British parliamentary order of the 17th century, the model for many later European constitutions, including revolutionary France's. The fourth is the federal experiment of the United States. As heirs to that Western tradition, we have a stake in how citizen bodies go to war, why such wars begin, and how they end. One case sits close beside it, the Punic Wars, Rome against Carthage in the 3rd century BC. Again, two republics with voting citizens. Together, these have long been the classic models. The second reason is the witness himself. The historian Thucydides was an Athenian who lived through the events he describes. He came from a great aristocratic family, probably the Phyllids, political opponents of Pericles. And yet, from his pages, Pericles rises as the model of a democratic leader in wartime. Writing from first-hand knowledge, Thucydides sets out the man's qualities and his strategy for winning the war, and places him far ahead of every leader who came after. Then Pericles dies in 429 BC, the 3rd year of the war. Much of what follows is really one long question. Why did the man who took his place fall so far short of him? Thucydides matters for something larger than one war. He set a standard for the writing of history in the West that still holds. Serious historians look to him as their model even now. But he was not the first. Herodotus, active half a generation earlier, wrote of the Persian Wars and the older traditions of Greece and the Near East, and he is often called the father of history. He has the classic Greek habit of standing a little outside his own world, observing other people's with a certain detachment in order, finally, to understand himself. Yet in sheer technique, Thucydides is arguably finer still, and to see why, you have to hear how he explains himself. Thucydides tells us at the very outset why he chose this war. He began writing at its outbreak, certain it would be greater than any war before it, because both sides stood at the height of their power, and because the whole Hellenic world was taking a side. Even those not yet fighting were weighing which way to lean. He calls it the greatest disturbance in the history of the Hellenes. The word he uses is kinesis, the root of our word kinetic, the Greek match for the Latin tumultus. It means a great upheaval, a shaking of everything. Hellenes is simply what the Greeks call themselves. And this upheaval, he says, reached beyond them into the non-Greek world and nearly the whole of mankind as it was then known, the Mediterranean and the Near East. Then he describes his method, and here he is unusually honest. When an ancient writer says book, he means a papyrus roll. The 8 books of Thucydides are 8 separate rolls, awkward things beside the bound volume you know today. He stresses the care he takes in checking his facts, and he reproduces speeches, the arguments made just before and during the war. Of these he makes a striking admission. He could not recall the exact words he says, whether he heard them himself or had them from others. So his rule was to hold as close as he could to the general sense of what was truly said, while making each speaker say what the moment seemed to demand. It is a remarkable thing for a historian to confess. So how far can we trust him? Most of what he knows comes from eyewitnesses and oral report, but at points he also turns to documents, decrees of the Athenian people cut into stone, and other official records. And wherever his facts can be independently checked, they hold up well. The speeches are another matter. They have divided scholars for centuries. Some read them as inventions composed to fit the moment, others as interpretive set pieces, written to complete the narrative. The stronger case treats them as interpretation, for no one now takes them as word-for-word quotation. So the line to hold is this. On the facts, Thucydides is reliable. It is on interpretation that he can be questioned. And his interpretation begins with a single sharp distinction, one that historians have used ever since. There are the true causes of a war, and there are the pretexts alleged for it. The genuine underlying cause he calls the Aitia. The openly stated excuses he sums up as the prophasis. The real cause he wants is exactly the one most likely to be hidden behind the surface arguments. And here he states his thesis, the sentence the whole series turns on. What made this war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear that growth struck into Sparta. Only after saying that does he set down the reasons each side gave aloud for breaking the peace. His own life shapes the value of everything he wrote. For the first 4 books, he is inside Athens, a member of its political class. He even holds command. He was elected one of the 10 generals chosen each year to lead the city's armies and the fleets. Then, in 424 BC, he fails in the field, and Athens exiles him. It is the making of his history. Those first 4 books cover what he saw in Athens among leaders he knew face to face. But from the 5th book on, he writes as an exile. And exile gives him the other side. Now he can reach the Spartans and their allies and gather remarkably good report from as far away as Sicily. His richest source was another exile, Alcibiades, the most dazzling and slippery figure of the age. The biographer Plutarch said the Athenians loved him, hated him, and could not do without him. Alcibiades fed Thucydides the inside story of the oligarchic coup of 411 BC and of the workings of the Persian governor's court. But he put himself at the center of every scene, and Thucydides, a fellow aristocrat exiled by the same democracy, worked hard to temper what he heard. The history itself breaks off in the 8th book. around 411 or 410 BC. For the rest of the war, we lean on lesser writers, Xenophon of the next generation, Diodorus Siculus centuries later, and above all Plutarch of Roman times, whose lives of the war's great figures still preserve a great deal. Thucydides tells us the war fell into 3 phases across those 27 years, roughly 2 generations of fighting men. The first was a 10-year struggle called the Archidamian War. The name carries an irony. Archidamus was a Spartan king who argued against the war and warned his people it would be a war like no other, one they would hand down to their children. He was proved right, and his name was fixed to the very fighting he had opposed. This phase ends in 421 BC with a grand 50-year peace between Athens and Sparta, meant to settle every dispute. It settled nothing. Thucydides was in Sparta, watched the oaths sworn, and judged the treaty flawed from the first day. The peace held in name only. Within a year, Sparta's own allies in the Peloponnesian League had rejected it. For 7 more years, from 421 to 414 BC, the 2 cities maneuvered and fought through proxies, the years in which Alcibiades rose. Then came the last phase, another 10 years, the Ionian War, or Thessalian War. Ionia is the Greek settled coast of Asia Minor, and the name marks this as a naval war across the Aegean. Thessalia was a fortress in Attica, Athens' own countryside, which the Spartans seized to strangle the city, 414 to 404 BC. Thucydides lived to see Athens fall. He describes her people marching out to tear down their own walls to the music of flutes, under the silent gaze of Spartan soldiers. He survived that day. He never finished his history. That neat shape, 1 war, 27 years, is partly Thucydides' own making. The frame a contemporary lays over what he lived through. You could argue the real story is longer. A chain of clashes between Athens and Sparta that begins around 461 or 460 BC and runs down to 375 BC, as the 2 cities fight again and again for the hegemony of Greece. A hegemon in Greek is a leader, the dominant city that binds lesser states by alliance and steers the whole. That long rivalry has been likened to the struggle for the mastery of Europe between 1870 and 1945, the subject of a study by the historian A.J.P. Taylor. Even so, Thucydides' account stands up remarkably well. How his war reached us is a story of its own. It runs through scholars and soldiers alike. Thucydides is still required reading at the American military academies of Annapolis and West Point, but the modern line begins in the 19th century with George Grote. A Victorian member of parliament and a lawyer, Grote wrote an 8-volume History of Greece, published in 1856 and reissued, enlarged, in 1874. He was a master of English prose, schooled from boyhood in Greek and Latin, with a command of the ancient texts that could outstrip a modern scholar's. What he lacked were the modern tools, archaeology, the study of coins, the patient reading of inscriptions. Yet he wrote a shrewd account, and like Thucydides before him, Grote was shaped by his own age, and the vision he cast has lasted to this day. For Grote wrote in the shadow of a recent war, Britain's long struggle against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. So he cast Athens as the forerunner of Great Britain, a society built on trade and the sea, on merit and a democratic principle, where a man rose by ability rather than birth. The link was one the British felt in their bones. Athens was a sea power, Sparta a land power. Sparta he painted as the more conservative, though the parallel with France never quite fits, and Grote may have had in mind the empire Napoleon built after 1805. That image, a land power against a naval power, with the naval power cast as the good guys, was handed down, and holds to this day. and it left the Spartans as caricatures of the people they truly were. The same frame was picked up again and again, each age fitting it to its own war. Early in the 20th century, it was revived by the historian Arnold Toynbee, a trained classicist. His mirror was the First World War. Britain, the naval power, set against the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm. In his hands, Sparta sank from merely conservative to regressive and unimaginative, locked in tradition. It rose once more in the Cold War, from 1945 to 1991, when it was the war's outbreak, not the war itself, that gripped scholars and policymakers, a model of how great powers run by their voters could stumble into a catastrophe far worse and far longer than anyone foresaw. Two hard truths of war hang over it. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, and no side ever wins the war it set out to fight because the war becomes something else. Then the modern scholars stepped in to argue with Thucydides directly. In 1969, Donald Kagan, professor of Greek history at Yale, published a landmark book, The Outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. He took direct aim at Thucydides' claim that Spartan fear had made the war inevitable. Not so, Kagan said. It was not inevitable at all. The Spartans could not control their own allies, and it was chiefly one of them, Corinth, that dragged them into war. He drew his evidence from Thucydides' own pages and reached a hopeful conclusion. Where states pursue clear, rational diplomacy, such wars can be avoided. It was a reassuring thing to believe in the middle of the Cold War. His book drew an answer from a very different scholar, the Englishman Geoffrey de Sainte-Croix, a Marxist who read history through its social and economic order. He too thought the war might have been avoided, but he was far less hopeful. Sparta, he argued, rested on the exploitation of a vast subject people, the Helots, something close in his frame to an early proletariat. That very system meant the Spartans were never truly free themselves, and their aggression was forced outward against Athens. So he laid more of the blame on Sparta, moving back towards Thucydides. But for him, the engine was not fear and emotion, it was economics. He stood in a long tradition that painted Sparta as the exploiting state in its purest form. For all their differences over blame and inevitability, Kagan and de Sainte-Croix agreed on one thing, that Sparta was conservative, regressive, oppressive, a people without the Athenians' imagination. And that agreement left them stranded before a plain fact. Sparta won. So much of their work, once the outbreak is dealt with, is really an account of how Athens lost, not how Sparta won. And that second question is the one too often neglected. This land power built a fleet and beat the Athenians in their own element, the sea, the mark of a formidable military power. Rome did the very same to Carthage in the Punic Wars. In both of antiquity's great conflicts, it was the plodding land power that in the end launched the winning fleets and remade itself in the process. The most recent major treatment came in 2005, A War Like No Other, by Victor Hansen, who had earlier written finely on the lived experience of Greek hoplite combat. This book, though, is pitched at a general audience and at the people who make policy and teach strategy in the military schools, and the journalists hunting a usable line from the past. Hansen reads the war through the struggle with fundamentalist Islam, the civil war in Lebanon, the wider breakdown of the Middle East, the ancient war as a guide to the modern one. And in his telling, Sparta fares worst of all. It hardens into caricature, a regressive society, not even truly Western, all but alien. Of every reading, he leaves the Spartans in the poorest light. But there is a case for the defense, and it rests on two facts these accounts forget. The first is that Sparta was never just a single backward town. She stood at the head of a great league that bound much of southern, central, and northern Greece. Its axis was the Gulf of Corinth, which cut the Greek world nearly in two at the narrow isthmus of Corinth. To the south lies the Peloponnesus and Sparta, to the north, central Greece. And that whole spine of land, its economy, its politics, its shrines, Sparta controls through her league, while the Aegean, its islands, and the coast of Asia Minor belonged to Athens. Sparta was far more than a lone city. And the second fact is the simplest of all. The Spartans won, bending those supposedly rigid institutions until they overcame Athens. Study the whole war, and the stranger truth surfaces. Athens and Sparta were far more alike than unlike. The modern readings, each straining to light up its own moment, drew the contrast far too sharply. Both were Greeks, living the city-state life exactly as Greeks defined it. They worshipped the same gods. When they swore oaths over a treaty, they meant to keep them, and the shared rights bound the two together. They fought the same way, the massed hoplite line, and even at sea their methods were versions of one shared craft. What divided them were differences of degree, not warring systems of economy, politics, and belief. Hold on to that, and the real questions open. Why the war came? Why it lasted so long, and in the end, why Sparta won and Athens lost. 2,400 years on, this quarrel between Athens and Sparta is still the West's classic study of how citizen-states go to war, because we watch it through the eyes of a man who checked his facts against stone and asked, before anything else, what the true cause had been. From Grote to Toynbee, from Kagan and de Saint Croix to Hansen, each generation has bent Thucydides to its own fears, and each has drawn the two cities too far apart. But the deeper truth of his history runs the other way. Athens and Sparta were far more alike than unlike, and that is where any honest account of this war has to begin.